Hello, I'm Piers Corbyn from Weather Action Long Range Forecasters and the Evidence-Based Science Campaign. It's great to be here, and I'm going to give you this climate change emergency masterclass, which will enable you to properly understand what the climate issue is all about, so you won't have to argue about it again. It'll be clear in your mind, and we'll also discuss what to do about it. Well, the key points to know and what we're going to show is that man-made climate change does not exist, and we will justify this, and that solar activity is the key driver of weather and climate. Now, I'm going to just say a few things about myself. I began doing science a long time ago when I was 7 years old, and I did try ideas of long-range forecasting and found them very difficult, and I'd given up in about 1982 or 3. However, because of the miners' strike, curiously, I restarted, and that was because people asked me during the miners' strike of 1984 if I could forecast the weather to find out what was going to happen during the miners' strike. And I did go back to it and said it was going to be a very cold winter in 84, 85, and it was. So I stayed with it then to improve our forecasts. So I think me being here, there's many people to thank, but one in particular would be to thank Arthur Scargill and Margaret Thatcher for having the miners' strike. And this is the Women Against Pit Closures t-shirt of 1984. Okay. In Weather Action Long Range Forecasters, we did test our forecasts with weather bets at William Hill, which were very successful. And we've had peer-reviewed papers showing our proven skill. And in terms of environmental activity, I was a councillor in 1986 to 1990, and during that time I chaired the South East London Combined Heat and Power Consortium Board, which introduced a waste-to-energy system in South East London. And the reason for it wasn't anything to do with CO2, it was to save money and reduce reduced water pollution, which happens from land dumping of waste. All right, now in this course of lectures, we're going to first of all discuss what's actually happening now in terms of what you might call as a fake weather crisis. And we're also going to discuss the science of man-made climate change, does or doesn't it exist? And then we're going to move on to the question of what does rule the weather, which we're going to explain is the sun. But even though we explain it's the sun, be clear that the man-made climate change theory fails of its own accord, not because of anything else is true. It fails because it itself is false. And we'll move on to discuss some of the politics involved in the climate emergency now. Right. Now, the first thing about what is happening now is to have a look at this graph here. These two graphs, the battle of the graphs. The top graph is the standard temperature graph which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations puts forward, and the BBC quote it, which shows uniform temperatures pretty well around the world for the last 1,000 or so years or more, and then a sudden rise supposedly due to man. Well, this graph is fraud. Now, the reason why we know it's fraud, apart from there being actual measurements to show what's really going on, is that there was a court case recently where in Canada Michael Mann, who's the author of that hockey stick graph it's called, took Tim Ball to court because Tim Ball had said to Michael Mann, you should be in the state pen, not Penn State University. And this was regarded as libel. So Michael Mann was asked to demonstrate why his graph was true, because Tim Ball had showed lots of faults in it, and Michael Mann consistently failed to produce evidence despite the court's request. So the case was thrown out and he was charged full costs and not allowed to bring it back. So we know that this graph he's put forward is fraud, and the truth is much clearer to what the IPCC originally recognised, namely the lower graph on there, which we'll discuss more about later. Okay, so now discussing a bit about recent weather in the last months and years. This is an interesting little picture here where at the end of June and early July 2019, we at Weather Action predicted this heat wave in Western Europe and the British Isles, and it happened on time, which was good. And we also warned that there would be some new solar activity, hits in the rush of particles that come from the sun, which would affect the weather in around July the 8th to the 11th. Now, this is a forecast map, and both our predictions came true. And an important thing to know about these predictions is that they involve what we call R5 periods or R4 periods, where it's extra activity on the sun in particles and magnetic connections with the Earth, which cause changes in the rush of particles from the sun, which is called the solar wind, and causes certain things to happen on Earth, mainly weather things, but in fact there appear to be also effects on the risk of earthquakes and volcanoes. And these are very important, of course, for what we do, and those sort of inputs are not anything which standard meteorology can deal with. Okay, now in late July 2019 there was some interesting stuff which actually turned out to be propaganda. There was another of these little heat waves which we predicted at Weather Action, and an interesting thing though was to the east of this it was very cold. Now the BBC went on talking about heat emergency and so forth, and they even said there would been these important records broken in Cambridge. Well, they indeed produced some temperatures in Cambridge, but these were from the Botanical Gardens, which is a relatively recent station or been recently affected by building, and they had a temperature of 38 point something, and said this was fantastic and implied it was caused by mankind's CO2. However, there was a strong southeast wind or a moderate southeast wind that day in very warm conditions, which caused this urban heating effect. At the same time, a longer existing weather station, a bit more in the countryside where there'd been no changes around it, reached 36.1 on the day. So it wasn't a big deal. The point is, the BBC are trying to make you believe something which isn't true. There was also some very extreme cold in Russia around that time, which was not mainstream news in any sense, although it should have been. Okay, and we're going to have a quick look at the jet stream now, which causes these extremes to happen, the changes in the jet stream. So we'll have a look at this demonstration. Okay, let's have a look at the jet stream. The jet stream is fast-moving upper air, which is about on this scale about the thickness of a piece of cardboard on the surface of this model globe. And it moves from west to east. And in generally warm periods, the jet stream is going to be shorter. The area which is cold, north of the jet stream, is going to be smaller, and the area that's warmer is below the jet stream. Is larger. And that is the situation which should happen under man-made climate change, so-called global warming periods. However, what we have now is a longer jet stream, which is more and more wavy, which can give quite extremes. And this is from low solar activity. It's a characteristic of low solar activity. And for example, if you have the jet stream going upwards past the British Isles, it'll be warm. And if it's coming downwards, and it could be a long fetch downwards, it could be extremely cold. So the characteristic of this south-shifted wild jet stream here are the extremes we see now. We see the wrong type of extremes for the CO2 theory. Okay, so the message we have is that the changes in the jet stream cause a lot of weather extremes. So are these extremes that have been reported anything to do with CO2? Well, the first thing is to understand that the jet stream now, as we said, is not doing what the global warming theory would do. And then we have these claims recently from people like the BBC that the climate warming now is unparalleled in 2,000 years. Well, and also it's more uniform worldwide than previous warming, such as the medieval warm period, for example. However, the reality is the data adjustments that they have been making are making it look as if the world is more uniform. So they make it warmer in colder parts of the world. Now, I'm not making this up. There's plenty of proven experts which have shown these adjustments. In fact, the American NOAA and so forth admit they're doing adjustments. They can't justify, to my mind, why they're doing adjustments, or indeed any reasonable person's mind, but they are doing adjustments which make the present look warmer and the past look colder. Okay, and you can find out more about all this stuff in this presentation which accompanies this lecture. Okay, now to understand where we're at, we're going to flash back 600 million years. Okay, now here we have a graph of estimates of the temperatures, which is the blue over the last 600 million years, and the black, which is the carbon dioxide estimated levels. Now you can see from that graph that there's no way you can argue that CO2 is somehow controlling temperatures on these timescales. They're both moving around in many ways. The really interesting thing, though, is the relative uniformity of the upper levels of global temperatures. So there's a lot of feedback mechanisms, natural processes, which hold the Earth temperatures into pretty steady states, or even steps of very warm, warm, cooler, and so forth. But no evidence on there that CO2 is ruling the show. Now, let's have a look at what's happened in the last 10,000 years, say. And we're choosing this 10,000 years because this is called an interglacial period, a warm period between ice ages. The natural state of the Earth in the last million years has been ice ages, separated every 100,000 years, 130,000 years or so, separated by warm periods called interglacials. We're in one such period now. In fact, we're towards the end of it, because we've had 10,000 years of this now. And now if you look at this graph, you can see, interestingly, for the last 10,000 years, there's been 10 peaks, sub-peaks within it, of about 1,000 years apart each, roughly. And the peak we're in now is number 10 on the graph, and it is the coolest of all these peaks, the coolest. Yet, official data says there's more CO2 around now than those previous peaks. And the time that climate people are arguing about is in the later part of that graph, if you notice, where we have LIA's Little Ice Age. We've come out of that now, but there's a simplified picture there, but it was very cold there. And before that we had the medieval warm period, item 9. And before that we had the Roman warm period, and which is number 8. And in that time, Hannibal, for example, marched through Spain to the Alps, and through the Alps with elephants from the North African rainforest, the North African forest, which was where the Sahara is. So it was much warmer then now. Climate was pretty different. African elephants were around and tamed, and now that piece of forest doesn't exist anymore. And Hannibal went in there and, fought the Romans from behind. Okay, and there's then previous other warm periods, the Minoan warm period before the Roman warm period, for example. Okay, well, let's just move on a bit further to more recently. Now, this is the last 150 years, and the upper graph there shows a 60-year cycle in American data. But if it doesn't happen in America, it doesn't happen anywhere in the world, as you know. And there is a similar 60-year cycle in world temperatures, which is in the lower graph. But this carbon dioxide, you see, follows that green line, which, of course, you can't argue that the green line is driving the black zigzag. It's ridiculous. Sometimes they move together, sometimes they move separately. So there's no evidence in this data that CO2 is driving temperatures. Also, you see the fluctuations in temperatures are many and various, whereas the CO2, smoothed out over a year is uniform. But the temperatures on there are smoothed out, but not, over some years. So it's not evidence that CO2 is controlling anything. And the graph below that, you can see rapid rises happening in temperatures on this world data every 60 years. So, the idea that we're just having rapid rises now, but haven't had them before, is untrue. They come with a 60-year cycle, the same as the temperatures, obviously. And we have an explanation, a magnetic, with lunar modulation explanation of this 60-year cycle, which is there. It's just that it's like beats in music. We're going to have, because the magnetic solar influence goes with a 22-year cycle. There's going to be beats between that and lunar modulation of the rush of particles coming from the sun, i.e. lunar modulation of the solar wind, which will have a 18.6 or 9.3 year modulation. And you can understand, if you think about it, there will be beats between these two musical notes. 3 times 22 is 66, and 5 times or 6 times 9 is 54, for example. So there's going to be something going on in those sort of times, and if you work it out, the beats turn out to be 58, 59 or 60 years, but they will vary with the length of the solar cycle too. But that is a very significant thing. Again, that is evidence against CO2 having any influence, because they don't match. The temperatures and the CO2 do not match. And here we have a more recent graph where the predictions from the UN and others was a increase of temperature of over half a degree to happen in the time from 1998 to 2017 or so. Well, it didn't happen. There was no increase. So their predictions are wrong. In that case and in basically all other cases. And here we have a sort of dramatic graph, the red one, of all their different models using CO2 as to what temperature rises are going to be. And that's the red graph. What's actually been observed is the balloon and satellite measurements, which are more accurate than surface measurements, which have shown pretty flat and in fact falling. In 2016 to 2018 there was a significant drop of world temperatures, while the models said they should be going up. And we had, well, snow in South Africa, for example, as shown by those elephants having, well, an elephant of a time, I suppose. Okay, now, what is going to happen next then, in our view, and the CO2 view? The CO2 view is we're going to have lots of warming. But our graph here compares smoothed out solar activity, because we know as an observed fact, which we'll discuss later, that average solar activity corresponds quite well with temperatures if it's smoothed out for more than 22 years, which is an important solar signal. So there's a graph here of estimates of solar activity 10 hail cycles apart. 10 times 22.1 gives 221 years, drawn up by Timo Neroma. And you can see there is a correspondence. I mean, this is a simplified graph, of course, but, you know, there is a correspondence. And if you accept that, you can see, if this correspondence continues, we are at the knee of the red curve dropping. There's the 2010 mark on there, and we're further on that. So we're expecting world temperatures to drop rapidly. And in fact, they are doing that now, and we'll give you more information on that later on. But what this graph points to is that we're going to move into one of these minimum of solar activities and corresponding cold, rather like the Dalton minimum during the Napoleonic Wars. Or it could be colder, like the Maunder minimum around 1650 or so. So this is on the cards. And we would say we are 100% sure this is beginning now and will happen. So let's have a look at solar activity, and we can discuss more about Sun-Earth connections, but let's have a look at this. Right now, you can count sunspot cycles, you see, from where they started counting them, and we have odd cycles and we have even cycles. And even cycles are usually cooler than odd cycles. And we are at the end of an even cycle, solar cycle 24. And we've moved now into the minimum between solar cycle 24 and the upcoming solar cycle 25, which is also expected to be very low activity, according to numbers of largely independent predictions. And we are ourselves at Weather Action very confident of these, but the Russians, for example, are also saying this with different ways of looking at things. So we have a graph of solar activity and smoothed out solar activity, which is the black line on there. And there's estimates of when the minimum of the smoothed out will happen, and that's on that graph it's 2042, but on the other graph I mentioned it's like 2030, 2035. I mean, I would go for the earlier one, definitely, but you know, this graph here was actually made before the other one. It's attributed there. Now, the sunspot counts are very interesting, because you can count the number of days of when there's been no sunspots on the sun. And now we're in the minimum, 2019, We've had a higher percentage of days of no sunspots than the last solar minimum, which was 2008. This is a sign of moving into the mini ice age. All right, now the actual weather corresponding to this, which is stuff not predicted by the CO2 theory, it's stuff which was not expected. Like there's this historic super blast in this 2017-2018 winter, for example, where there was these seashore freezing over in many parts of North Europe, some extreme cold in Britain, which are not the global warming story. And the reason for these cold blasts comes, as we said already, because of the wild jet stream, which is moved further south than the CO2 theory would expect, and it's much, much more wavy. And this is something which has happened before, as far as we can see, during these mini ice ages, little ice ages, like the Maunder minimum and the Dalton minimum. Contrary to what the BBC has been telling you, there has been big increases in glacier growth. This, for example, the Jakobshavn Glacier, the biggest in Greenland and probably the most important glacier in the world, for that reason, has been growing over the last 3 years. But this has not been news on the BBC. Why is that? The facts negate the CO2 warmism story. Okay. The North Atlantic has been getting colder. Now, it's complicated what happens in the North Atlantic, but nevertheless, when we move into a mini ice age, this would happen in quite a big way. Here's another little example here of a heat wave in 2018 now, the hot summer of 2018, which is a bit like 1976, for example. That was very well predicted by us at Weather Action, and this is a particular part at the end of July, which we got well predicted. And the BBC were jumping around saying this is a heat wave round the world. Okay, well, you know, this was completely over the top because it ignored the cold parts of Russia and Japan and so forth. And in fact, on the 30th of July, the Northern Hemisphere land average temperature was 0.2 degrees centigrade below normal, which the BBC didn't tell you. So you see, they have a narrative. So once you know they've got a narrative, it means that you've got to be a bit careful about things they say. I mean, the United Nations told us about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, supposedly, which didn't exist. The same United Nations is giving you a story now. But okay, you don't have to believe anything I say, just look at the facts. That period of in summer 2018 was also associated with very cold weather in Australia, where the Southern Hemisphere has been hit by the same sorts of extremes as we are in the Northern Hemisphere. So our message is that the mini ice age is here. And despite what you've been told, the area of ice cover in the Arctic has been increasing recently, over the last year or two or three. It was decreasing before, absolutely true. But the BBC only report half the story. The crucial thing to understand is that it's the wild jet stream which is causing what we see. And for example, these type of extremes of warm and extreme cold have happened in previous mini ice ages. For example, the Maunder minimum mini ice age included the Great Fire of London of 1666, where there was an extremely warm blast, hot blast, in the summer of 1666, and it was called the Belgian wind. Now, we know bad things come from Belgium, so you can understand why it's called the Belgian wind, perhaps, in modern terms. But that led to London being a tinderbox, and somebody struck a whatever, and we had the Great Fire of London. But the winters before then, after then, and years around then were extremely cold, and the Thames froze over a number of times. Okay, so now that's the end of part 1, and I hope you're going to join us again for part 2, where we're going to discuss more about the science, or the lack of it, in man-made climate change. Thank you.